Today we're doing something a little bit different. I don't at all expect to give a completely unbiased review. This is a game that I played quite a bit during my childhood after all. But I think it'll be easier for us all if I segment the review into portions, specific areas instead of just rambling, so I can, with a more direct focus, clearly define what I find to be either good or bad, past the bias that I will probably have. Though I do expect to ramble at some point anyway. Also, this is an updated review, updated from an older review I made on the original Diablo and its expansion way back on a Tumblr account I had and properly maintained at one point, which you can still find if you really want to and search for it, though I don't post anything on it anymore, so I don't know why you would. Like with the 2077 review, I'll be keeping relevant things in and changing things where applicable as I deem necessary. Cool? Cool. Somewhere along the way, from the permanently grafted into my memory show me the money and power overwhelming cheats to the complete non-existence of the so-called cow level, as if that was ever actually a thing, Blizzard has done a large amount to solidify its place among the list of all-time favorite games that I have ever played, which is something that I can't deny despite the taboo that the company elicits now. By putting out two titles that helped found the things that I most often look for in the games that I play today. This wasn't for no reason, of course. Enter one of the most notable games Blizzard has ever released in its admittedly acclaimed history, Diablo 2. This was a game created by Blizzard North, released in the year 2000 with an expansion dubbed Lord of Destruction, released in 2001. The largely successful game was a sequel to the first Diablo. The original title featured 3 playable characters and focused on the labyrinth beneath the incredibly unlucky town of Tristram, which the sequel and its expansion, well, expanded on, with 7 classes to choose from, 5 acts to traverse through, and a multitude of dungeons and enemies to plunder and murder respectively. Then just last year, Diablo 2 Resurrected released a remaster of Diablo 2, in which this review is covering. Diablo 2 Resurrected was originally announced in February of last year, and it was co-developed by Blizzard, working mostly on back-end details, and Vicarious Visions, working on the front end. If Vicarious sounds familiar to you, they should. They also worked on the Pro Skater and Crash Bandicoot remasters. This is right up their alley. The game opens after you've selected a character and following the initial cutscene that frames the story. Marius is someone that Tyrael has been searching for and has finally found inside an asylum. This is because some events, specifically his encounters and more specifically his travels with the so-called Dark Wanderer, have left him maddened. Following the cutscene, you finally enter the game proper. Act 1 follows the player in their quest to help out the Rogues, or the Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye, a large group whose duties and jobs range from archery to smithing to selling to murdering the creatures along the countryside, though not necessarily in that order. Quickly, it's discovered that the player is really fucking good at kicking the monster's collective asses, and the true journey of Diablo 2 begins, with constant allusions to the mysterious Dark Wanderer whom you're chasing, and even a brief quest to rescue a certain someone from a wrecked and very obviously cursed Tristram. I mean, seriously, that place has to be cursed. There's so much bad shit going on there. The game seems to have a slow start. It picks up though as you actually start delving into the game's, well, gameplay. As you journey through the game's 5 acts, you'll discover a few things. Oh, and by the way, if you're worried about spoilers for a remaster of a game that's over 2 decades old, too late. One of the first true discoveries you make is that the Dark Wanderer is actually the hero from the first game, and Diablo, whose soul stone he forcibly shoved into his head as a means of containing him, has at some point taken over his body, which raises some questions like, how does this actually affect the hero himself? Is he a prisoner in his own body, or has his soul been effectively ejected from his physical form? Or was his personality and mind influenced the same way that Lazarus was until it eventually consumed him physically as well? Also, didn't Lazarus need a child in order to properly bring Diablo back into Sanctuary, or was that more of a means to try and expedite the process, speeding it up instead of taking the apparent 5 years between the first and second game's events? Also, the Soul Stone is the one thing that effectively tethers Diablo and the other primevals to Sanctuary. Bound to Sanctuary by Tyrael, it's revealed that destroying the Soul Stones via the Anvil of Annihilation also sends the souls of the contained beings, in this case the primevals, to the Black Abyss, so it kills them permanently, or does it just condemn them, banish them into a void until they eventually come back? In either case, why didn't Tyrael and his Herodrum plan to do this in the first place? I get that they potentially couldn't do that for Baal since his Soulstone was shattered in the process of trying to contain him, and so Tal Rasha had to volunteer himself to contain Baal's essence, but both Diablo, at least prior to the events of the first game, and Mephisto had complete Soulstones at one point, and they were instead hidden away? Or is this something that can only happen with shattered Soulstones, in which case, how did Mephisto be defeated since it's never stated that his stone was shattered? Maybe there are just pieces of the puzzle I'm missing here, but this just confusing confusing to me. Maybe it's something stated in one of the books, because there's a few. There are other elements I liked though. Since there are 3 classes you can choose from in the original title, there are 3 characters directly alluding to those classes within the game. None of those characters have a happy ending, which is understandable given it is this game after all. I really like how each of them have been fleshed out. The warrior is Prince Aiden of Kondoros, and it was his brother that Lazarus kidnapped to bring Diablo into reality, which gives him an actual reason to have entered Tristram's dungeon and subsequent potential catalyst for Diablo's corruption in the first place, eventually turning him into the Dark Wanderer and later into Diablo himself. The sorcerer Jizreth eventually becomes the Summoner, a quest boss you can find in the Arcane Sanctuary in Act 2. In his efforts to find Horizon's sanctuary and attain the power to command dark forces, he became corrupted and inadvertently also opened a gateway beneath the palace, allowing demons and creatures to spill forth and kill the harem that had been secluded there. The rogue, Morena, was a member of the Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye, the people whose camp you consider a hub in Act 1, and Dariel found some means of corrupting her and, after taking the name Blood Raven, began raising the dead at the Sisters' burial grounds and became undead herself, taunting her former friends with their newly deceased. The world is further expanded on as well. The first game didn't really explain too much of the world it took place in, which, seeing as the game takes place almost entirely in the same 16-floor dungeon, makes sense. All of this is good. The most obvious thing that the remaster brings to the game is the immensely updated and upgraded graphics. I mean, the original game came out over 2 decades ago, so a remaster had damn well look better now than it did then. And to further draw the line between how the 2 iterations look, you can freely change the graphics at any time in gameplay by pressing G, which is a feature I really like, honestly. It's just cool to see it. It doesn't hurt that the game already had a look that was instantly recognizable. Its grim aesthetic is so well known and defined the genre so overwhelmingly and completely that it's often replicated in other titles in the genre. So much so that games that don't have that aesthetic outright have to have that visual difference pointed out, like Torchlight or Fate. The character selection screen, likewise, is one of my favorites from any game ever. All of these characters standing around this campfire, each with their own little animation that partially denotes the personality of that character. I just love it. The first Diablo just had this boring menu with a picture corresponding to each class, but to be fair, it came out before Diablo 2 and thus might not have had the same technological innovations and might not have been able to do a menu like this to begin with. And Diablo 3 has that little looping video at the side, which, while it does suggest what the class can be used for, doesn't really give those characters the personality that this title's character selection does, and doesn't have the excuse that Diablo did, so meh. The UI, while visually updated, is still reminiscent of its time, however, taking up a good portion of the bottom of the screen and potentially blocking the actual gameplay as a result. It's also able to become more cluttered through choices that you, as the player, can make. You can assign quick keybinds to skills, but they take up space off of the HUD, and again, onto potentially the actual gameplay, and thus obstructing some elements that one would rather see. The monsters have this visually interesting variety to them. What kind of creatures you face depends on what environment and acts you're in, though a good amount of them are just reskins of mechanically the same monster several times over, though visually they look good and are differing enough that I can forgive it. A fantastic example that I didn't really notice at first is the fetishes in Act 3. A fetish, apart from being unfortunately named, is this small enemy well known for being annoying when alone and painful when in a group. They are functionally similar to the various forms of Fallen or Devilkin you come across, and even have their own shaman that revives them if left unattended. The fetish shaman, however differing from their fallen counterparts, is just 2 fetishes stacked on top of each other. This is adorable, I love it. And even better is that if you kill the fetish shaman, technically, you only killed one. You may have lifted the weight from his shoulders, or that weight was his friend, so now he's coming after you. The game also comes with cutscenes, actual full cutscenes that frame the story that you're currently playing through, as cutscenes tend to do, and they look utterly fantastic. It's admittedly hard to look at the original cutscenes now in comparison as a result. The music and audio is again a standout even among its genre. Matt Uelmen, whose name I'm really hoping I'm not mispronouncing, returned to work on Diablo 2 and its expansion, and his talents are still heard here in the Resurrected remaster. It is fantastic. In fact, it was so good that Uelmen and 3 others, Jason Hayes, Glenn Stafford, and Andrea Pesano, won the International Game Developers Association's Award for Excellence in Audio due to their work in Diablo 2. Their competition, Thief 2, and both Samba de Amigo and Space Channel 5, 2 other games that were literally designed with their music specifically in mind. If that doesn't tell you how good it is, I don't know what does.
The lost Herodric scroll! What a fool!
My companion drew in the dank, cold air of the tomb.
For the most part, Diablo 2 and the remaster follow the same base gameplay loop that the original had. You know, dungeon delving, monster murder, and loot leveling? Look, writing's hard. There were still some substantial differences between the two titles, though. The first one came in the form of the classes, of which there are now 7. The Paladin, Sorceress, Barbarian, Necromancer, Amazon, Assassin, and Druid. Each of these classes can play vastly differently, and come with 3 separate skill trees. The closest that the original title had to any kind of skill tree were the tomes that, upon reading, would either teach you a spell, or level up that spell if it's one you already knew. Diablo 2 does away with tomes almost entirely, although it does retain the Book of Town Portal and Tome of Identification, the first for Town Portal and the second for identification, shockingly, and replaces it with these skill trees that, honestly, I love. My favorite class, the Necromancer, comes with the skill trees of summoning, the various minions that the Necromancer is well known for, curses, applying debuffs to varying effects, and poison and bone, mostly offensive abilities. Personally, I tend to play my favorite class, again, the Necromancer. I can't stress enough, it will always be my favorite, as a kind of support character to debuff the foes that my Skeleboys come across. I raise the dead to fuck up everyone's day, throw a blood golem out there for its tanking and life leech capabilities, and hex those still living enemies with things like Weaken, Life Tap, and Decrepify. But that's just me. You could also use skills like Teeth and Corpse Explosion to increase your own personal DPS, or Poison Dagger and Bone Armor to join your Skeleboys on the front line, or avoid using those skills entirely if you want. This kind of pick and choose skill system I love, it's fantastic. Refining your build by allotting your skill points how you like it as you level is immensely rewarding. The only true downside is there's a level of commitment you have to accept as you continue in the game, which is to say, there's no easy way to respec. This is a half-truth, actually. Every single character you make gets 1 free respec after you complete a certain quest in Act 1, something that is thankfully repeatable through differing difficulties. But other than that, respecking requires certain items that lie within the loot pool of various enemies, and even then, that's only after successfully beating the game on its hell difficulty. Apart from the classes, there's also a companion/mercenary system wherein you can pay gold for help from NPCs along your journeys. Each act, apart from Act 4, has their own specific kind of mercenary available that you can hire either immediately or after a quest in that specific act. And since each act's companions have their own benefits and downsides, it's a good idea to find one that suits your specific playstyle. Your first introduction to this system is the Rogue Scout you'll obtain as a companion after the Sister's Burial Ground quest in Act 1. There is a slight issue though. The companion AI can be a bit iffy. Sometimes they'll just run ahead into a force of murderous enemies that live up to their reputation, or get lost and left behind only to meet the same fate. The good news is, even if they die, you can just pay a resurrection cost to the one who hired them out to you, and they're back good as new. The bad news is this might be required if you want the loot you equipped them with prior to their death, since you can't grab it from their corpse, which is unlike you yourself. Yeah, Diablo 2 has corpse runs, but if you clear out literally every enemy as you come across them, then the run might not be as difficult as it was going through it the first time. My first death was in Act 3, and as you can see, the jungle is clear of ferocious foes, though it isn't clear of frame drops. I don't know what the exact cause was, but something about Act 3's jungle environments made the game chug hard. Notably, this wasn't true of its dungeons, those were mysteriously fine. It also wasn't true of the other acts, those were also fine. The only reason that I'm proud specifically that my first death was in Act 3 is because Act 2 had some, challenges. Ironically, the Maggot Lair wasn't the only place with what I call the corridor issue, where its mostly long, nearly single-file hallways cause serious body blocking and almost entirely unavoidable attacks doing nothing but aggravating the hell out of me. All made much worse by the lightning ass bugs whose main method of self-defense is turning into a six-legged version of Electro minus the appeal of Jamie Foxx. Act 2 also had the Arcane Sanctuary, and it had the same problem. Minus enemies that shoot out charged bursts, thankfully. They can still throw up flame walls though, so there is that. A big plus is the way that loot works, most specifically in the kinds of loot available. Each individual act has different potential drops and equipment that correspond to the enemies and especially unique enemies found therein. That's not a surprise, that's par for the course for these kinds of games. Among these drops are the stuff you might expect to find. Your standard money and gear, but Diablo 2 also introduced quite a few new items into the loot pool. The first most direct upgrade from previous loot are socketed items. These are items that themselves have slots that you can place certain other items into. For the most part, you'll likely be placing various kinds of gems into those sockets, and each gem has their own qualities that modify the item they've been socketed into. There are also jewels, which despite the name are separate from gems and have random modifiers, whereas gems have distinct modifiers that depend on the kind of gem and its quality. Beyond gems and jewels are the really cool, stand out if I'm being honest, runes, which have a level requirement to even socket in the first place, and come in around 30 different flavors, some of which were introduced in and thus unique to the remaster. Runes have distinct modifiers that don't have quality tied to them. Every tall rune will be the same as every other tall rune, but, and this is important, you can socket them in a specific order into specific items to form a rune word, which either heightens the item incredibly or just makes a whole new item. There are also charms, items which grant bonuses so long as they're in your inventory and have been identified, making use of the Tome of Identification if you still have it in your inventory, although scrolls work too, allowing you to identify it as soon as you pick it up and gain its benefits immediately. They come in varying sizes with varying effects, and I really love these additions to the loot pool. Like, these things that can change how other items function or impart benefits beyond being equipable to the character and thus raising their stats, it's just really fucking cool. Another addition is the following. While the original title had normal, magic, and unique items, that is, for the purpose of this comparison, unmodified, modified, and named, Diablo 2 has normal, magic, rare, unique, and set items, as well as socketed variants of each. While the difference between normal, magic, and rare items often come down to the number and range of modifiers, set and unique items are fairly different. Set items are much more interesting than the others, I feel, especially because each individual item of a set has unique properties to it that it gains based on having other items in the set, which is unlike its sequel's take on set items, where you gain benefits overall while having a specific number of items from the set equipped. You also have your own personal and shared stash to shove your loot into as well, unlike just dropping stuff off on the ground in Tristram when your inventory is full up like in the first game. You can put money inside, since money no longer takes up the slot in your inventory, as well as items, provided that there's room since they do still take up inventory space. Did I forget to mention this game is well known as a loot fest? Well, it is, and I'd also suggest keeping a few scrolls of Town Portal or that book I talked about earlier on hand. One thing I always find myself annoyed by in this game, though it's not specific to this game, there isn't that much space in your inventory. My skeletons and golem can clear a room of babbling devilkin, but I don't have enough inventory space to take all their drops and sell it if I want to, leading to the common conundrum of deciding what to leave on the ground behind and what to take with me. You'll be getting your loot mostly from, and this may surprise you, the demons and creatures plaguing the game's world. You'll get especially interesting loot from the unique monsters, who have a yellow nameplate, signifying their uniqueness. A good Act 1 example is the Countess, a boss, if you can call her that in comparison to the much deadlier bosses that you can find in the game, that you can expect to encounter at the end of the Fallen Tower quest. Below her name and health bar is also a very brief description of what makes her unique. Demon Fire Enchanted. She's a demon who lights things on fire. These descriptions don't give you perfect information, however, as they neglect to mention that she's also stronger than her, normal demon allies. Normal in air quotes, though you could likely assume that, given the whole unique thing, that she would be deadlier. Some unique monsters like the Countess are scripted with quests tied to them, while others seem random right down to their name. I remember playing this game years ago and coming across a Devilkin in the same tower I encountered the Countess in whose name was, I shit you not, Seethe Burn the Dead. Is his name Seethe Burn and nicknamed the Dead? Or is his name Seethe and then his nickname's Burn the Dead? Or is that just what he's known for so everyone calls him that? I digress, there's some minor faults though. On release, there wasn't really any proper endgame content like Path of Exile's maps or Diablo 3's bounties and rifts, so when it came time to endgame, or postgame I guess would be more accurate, people were just left farming the same areas and same 3 bosses over and over, just at differing difficulties. Recently that kind of changed though. With patch 2.5 came the introduction of terror zones, but those seem more geared towards experience farming rather than loot farming based on the patch notes, so a nice addition but a year late and 20 years late relative to the original release. Another fault is that they seemed very pick and choose with some of the changes and lack thereof between the original release and the remaster. Money can be picked up as you walk talk over it. Offline difficulty scaling via a text command. UI showing quick keybinds for skills. Shared and expanded stash. Yes, good. Gems and runes don't stack. The Herodric Cube doesn't have an in-game recipe list. Mercenary gear gets completely destroyed when hiring a new mercenary. Lack of an optional loot filter to more easily notice various items. No easy means to respec your character. No, bad, you're bad. The worst change is probably how online is handled though. Instead of say launching and asking whether or not you would rather play offline or on, it just automatically tries to connect online before anything else. It should be an opt-in or opt-out, not an automatic forced connection, likely due to an always online DRM check to ensure your copy of the game's legitimate. LAN parties are a no-go now. Yeah, they removed LAN and TCP/IP support because, quote, we will no longer be supporting this option as we identified potential security risks and are committed to safeguarding the player experience, unquote. Not everyone was excited about this. Act 4 is also still a major disappointment. Really short, 3 quests, only 1 truly remarkable enemy. It's not really fair to blame the remaster alone though, because as a remaster, it had no choice but to work with what was already there to begin with. Act 4 has always had this problem, and it's as such always been disappointing, and it still is now. It's a damn shame. Maybe throw in cut content or something, I don't know, but come on, it's hell. You fucked up hell. It's a damn shame. As remasters go, most of what's new is admittedly its fresh coat of paint. It's mostly the same game with mostly the same highs and mostly the same lows. I can't overstate the love I feel for this game. I wholeheartedly recommend it, but you should bear in mind that A, I am very biased, and B, again, it's a remaster of a game from the turn of the century and hasn't changed some of the more noticeable issues the game has had since its conception 2 decades ago. Still, I prefer some of this game's choices over the third's. Story out.